Hey guys, I wanted to discuss today a little bit about the difference in approach between the Ukrainians and the Russians. And the difference is an approach of passion and emotion, and an approach of logic and rationality. And when I say this, I talk about it as a generality. It doesn't mean that the Ukrainians are devoid of logic and that the Russians have no emotion. There's always a mix of both in people. But this is the difference that I see being represented by either side. And it's represented both in the approach to what's going on, as well as it's represented in the callousness and the cruelty on both sides. Now, the Ukrainian type of cruelty we've seen in videos already. Their cruelty is the type where, out of passion, out of emotion, feeling that they are completely justified, they are capable of completely dehumanizing the enemy and torturing and embarrassing, what's the better word, humiliating the person and killing them, and all justified within the passion, within them feeling that they're right to do so, because the people have invaded their land and that's the end of the story. So now anything goes. And you see this represented, if you go to some of the forums and all these things. And when it comes to passion, a passion can't be controlled. So all these videos that are coming out of soldiers being tortured and everything, there's going to be more coming out. I mean, they can try to hold those in, but because it's an act of passion, it's an act of emotion, they're going to keep doing these things, and they're going to keep saying the things that they're saying, like the doctor saying that he's going to castrate the soldiers, or that they're not going to take any prisoners. Or even if you look at the forums, you see people saying that, well, all Russians need to die, and they give them nicknames and stuff. And that's why they paint the people like orcs. They paint them in green when they tie them up to the poles. Is they want to dehumanize the people, because one of the things you have to do in a war is dehumanize the other person. So you don't see them as a human being, you see them as a caricature of who they actually are. And it also ties into the Ukrainian nationalists seeing the people from Russia as not Slavic, even though a lot of people from the west of Ukraine I wouldn't consider Slavic, they're more Germanian or whatever it is, but from that kind of, from Austrian, that type of thing. If you want to look at it ethnically, I think they're closer to that than the Slavic people that came from the Kievan Rus, which is a bit ironic, but it's not to get into it. It shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter what your ethnicity is, because racism is stupid. But if you're going to look at that way, that's how they look at the things. They look at them as the marauding hordes or the ancestors of the Mongols. So when Mongols had Russia, they believed Russians are the ancestors of the Mongols. So they're not really white. So that's where that kind of comes from. It's a lot more to it, but that's where it comes from. Now, the Russian kind of cruelty is more rational. It's more logical. And what I mean by that is it's very stoic, but it doesn't make it any less cruel. But Russians act in cruelty when it's logically rational to do so. So, for the most part, they wouldn't go out of their way to torture someone, to torture a soldier, unless it somehow benefit them. So if in this war, torturing soldiers and basically making the enemy terrified of what you're going to do to them if they continue fighting you, Russians will skin men, women and children alive. They will do any kind of horrible thing without blinking an eye. They're capable of that. And they're certainly capable of dropping nukes all over the world and wiping millions of people out. And that kind of cold, hard logic is best represented in the words of Stalin, for example, where he said, "One death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic." There's actually a scene in a movie, I think it was like Bad Boys 2 or Bad Boys 3, and that was a really good representation because the Russian there is a drug dealer who goes to the home of a Colombian drug lord. And the Colombian drug lord has his partner murdered and then chopped up into pieces and put into a barrel. And then his partner doesn't even wince. He's just like, well, you think this is something new? I've seen this, 1,000 times before. It doesn't affect me. Of course, later on in the movie, he does get emotional about it. But that's the kind of attitude. If it benefits logically to do something destructive, they will do it. But in general, they're not going to do something destructive if there isn't a logic behind it. They won't do something just emotional, especially something that's emotional that logically they can see is going to harm them, or is going to be a worse strategy when taking the logical step. Both things have their good and bad aspects to it, because generally you need some emotion to motivate yourself to fight. So the Ukrainians are very, very motivated, and the Russians are just doing their job. And you'll probably hear that. I've seen that even in the soldiers that they interviewed. And there's actually even an exchange from the Chechen War. I think it was the tank commander, and the Chechen is pleading emotionally, because maybe that is also an emotional and logical fight. But the Chechen is pleading emotionally for the guy to stop because they're going to get killed. And the Russian is just very calmly like, this is my job, I'm going to do it no matter what. And that does garner a little bit of respect, just like Ukrainians garner respect for their passionate desire to defend their homeland. But that's also covered their senses up to see what's actually going on. And it's actually done that to a lot of people, I believe. They can't see they're being taken for a ride by the West. They can't see the damage that's permanently being done to them and their homeland, because they're in an emotional state. And it's really sad, because I think it's scary, because they might not be able to take that logical step of surrendering when it's time to do so. But we'll see if that happens or not. And I'm always, happy to say that I was completely wrong with analyzing the situation. But to analyze it, this is what I see. And I do see it as a bit of a game of chess that's happening. And that is that in the beginning of a game of chess, you set your pieces out and you try to get the best position on the board. And to do that, you might have to sacrifice your pawns or trade them. And that's kind of what the Russians did in this beginning, in this first stage, is they set their positions up. They got their positions as best as they could using their conscripted forces, the forces that weren't that motivated, that aren't that experienced, that aren't that well trained. But they did the best that they could, and they've gotten their position ready. The second phase that's happening now is where you go in and you try to get an advantage by destroying as many of the other person's pieces as you can. And that's when you send your heavy artillery in. That's when you send your special forces in. And I'm already kind of seeing that happening. I think I heard with the mercenaries, the Wagner group going in, and people say, well, that's not enough people, but that's only one group that we know that's going in there. We don't know what else is happening, but at this stage, it seems like the Ukrainians are being set up for slaughter. And all these, them pushing back a little bit, I think in the next week or two, that's all going to come to a screeching halt. And a lot of people are going to be shocked by what's going to happen now, because they have been emotionally committed and emotionally believe that Ukrainians are currently winning, when I don't believe so. And I think, because I don't think Ukrainians will make a deal now. I mean, ideally, Ukrainians should make a deal now and get the best deal that they can. But I don't think they're going to do that. But hopefully, once they see that it is a losing struggle for them, they will cut a deal and get the best deal that they believe they can get for Ukraine. Because in stage 3, or the third phase, once the Russians have done as much damage to the Ukrainian main forces and obliterated as much as they can, they're gonna just go around hunting for the king. They're gonna basically just clean up everything else around there, because now they're gonna have the overwhelming power, and there's really not gonna be much to stop them. And I really don't want it to reach the stage, because that's the stage where if you're still working on emotion, if you're still working on a fantasy, you cause the most damage to your civilians. You send in kids to fight that are just going to die. And there's been enough death already in this war. And, I say this, I'm not saying this to appeal to anyone. I know no one's going to listen to me, and, who am I? I'm just like a person on YouTube and stuff. But this is how I feel. This is what I think. And I think I'm very correct. And, time will tell who's right and who's wrong. And I'm happy to be proven pleasantly wrong. Of course, I don't think either side is that great. I think the best solution to this whole mess is whichever causes the least damage and the least deaths. And I believe that is the Ukrainian surrender, and you can call me a coward for that, but nonetheless, we will see. And one consolation, I guess, the Ukrainians can have is, at the end of the day, once the game is going to be done, we're all going to be packed up in the same wooden box.